my distinct honor this morning to be introducing new media scholar Dr. Megan Boler. Dr. Boler is currently a professor of Theory and Policy Studies. She teaches at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. Prior to this, she has taught at many prestigious universities, including Virginia Polytechnic Institute. Excuse me. She's held a fellowship on the theme of cyberdisciplinarity at Dartmouth College also. Dr. Boler received her PhD in the history of consciousness from the University of California at Santa Cruz, a distinctive institution for cultural studies and interdisciplinary work. In her career thus far, Dr. Boler has published numerous articles, books, and publications, including her book, Feeling Power, Emotions, and Education. In the anthology that she edited, Digital Media and Democracy, Tactics in Hard Times, Dr. Boler provides a skeptical approach to media that brings a fresh perspective to the concept of reliability. The focus of her research is political propaganda surrounding the war in Iraq and the crafted science of perception management in all aspects of the media, particularly news and internet sources. Perception management encompasses the strategies that different media employ to control the message that is ultimately perceived by the audience. Her research has revealed that there is an abundance of what she labels as digital dissent. Online communities, bloggers, and activists have used their own digital media as methods to speak out against the politically crafted mass media. Verification of identities and trust of information is further explored in her research, focusing on such user-generated content as blogs and social networking communities. In her model, the producer and the consumer are one and the same, creating a unique and puzzling power relationship. Internet mediums eliminate the body, and therefore leave users only with their instincts to decide the validity of what they see. Messages are easily manipulated on the internet, where every user has a license to produce writings, images, etc., based on their own beliefs and not concrete facts. As a student of new media theory, I find the propensity for deception in internet media settings astonishing. I'm fascinated by the methods that Dr. Boler's research for analysis provides, and I greatly look forward to hearing her point of view. At this time, please join me in welcoming Dr. Megan Boler.
I'm so happy to be here with you today and really excited to share my thoughts both on women in power and to share with you some of my research. And first, I really want to thank Ali for such a fine introduction. I look forward to talking to you at the break. And thank you very much to Michelle White, who is part of what brought me here, and Jan Mulvihill, whose work clearly made this happen, and Molly Travis and all who organized this event. I'm going to start with, because I've been listening to the women who've come before me the past couple of days, and it seems to me that part of what we want to do here is offer some inspiration about how we overcome some of the obstacles that are put in the paths of women in order to transform the world and find our ways in terms of power. So I want to share a little bit of how I came to where I am and how I came to be somebody who fights as a public intellectual to make the voices of marginalized people, including women, heard, particularly in terms of media and in terms of challenging the dominant culture. But the last time I was in New Orleans, I invited my mother to join me. I was here for a conference. She doesn't travel very much at all. That trip became a high drama about, in fact, women in power, or perhaps more accurately, women and powerlessness. Perhaps because I'm an only child of a single mother, in addition to enjoying your beautiful city, I also spent a vast amount of time, that was very precious time traveling with her, worrying in the days prior to my mother's departure because a big storm was brewing, which I foresaw would affect her flight back to San Francisco. Of course, instead of simply asking her if that flight delay would tremendously upset her, I just assumed it would, and assumed also that I needed to try and adjust the universe in order to assure that my mother would not suffer any anxiety should her plane be delayed in the major storm. I learned extremely painfully and sorely that there are two things Actually, correct that, 3 things over which I am powerless. 1, the weather, 2, airlines, and 3, my mother and her anger when I try and control her or the things around her. I definitely needed at that time, and I don't think you have one here in New Orleans, a 12-step group I've not yet found, Weather, Airplanes, and Mother Controllers Anonymous. I'm delighted to be here at Newcomb College, honoring women and dedicated to women's diverse ways of transforming our world. As Donna Brazile said yesterday, we have to hurry history. We cannot wait for men to give us a seat at the table. She spoke of the climate of fear men create to discourage women from running for state and public office. This is a perennial and deeply disturbing reality. And that is the double bind that we face as women. And so, as a scholar of images, I've spent a lot of time, if you go to Google and you type in the name of a powerful woman, Nancy Pelosi, I haven't done Donna Brazile and Kathleen Blanco, but if you type in the name of a woman, it's really interesting to see what are the images in Google and which ones come up first. And for Hillary Clinton, there's quite a lot of debasing ones. And when you type in men's names, you really don't see those kinds of images. But the double bind is something that threads through my entire talk today. And that double bind is this. If we behave like men, we are called aggressive. Hillary Clinton was called a she-goat. We're called, and pardon my language, bitches, etc. And if we behave according to our expected gender roles, and Donna Brazile mentioned this yesterday, we are seen as too weak and vulnerable to lead others. And I often think of Virginia Woolf, so remarkably ahead of her time. And if you haven't read her book, A Room of One's Own, written in 1929, you really must. She wrote this amazing feminist treatise, really so far ahead of her time. And she herself, you may not know this, was not allowed to approach publishers with any of her manuscripts due to the sexism of her day, which prohibited women from being writers and equated women's writing with the expression of female desire, and therefore saw writing for women as akin to prostitution. Her husband had to represent Woolf's book to publishers. Another example, recently I was co-teaching a philosophy class that primarily featured male philosophers, Gilles Deleuze, and I researched the history of Simone de Beauvoir's life, which was primarily in the shadows of Jean-Paul Sartre. Not only does it come to light that Sartre may have fully borrowed de Beauvoir's own ideas for his work Being and Nothingness from her shorter and much more lucid book, Ethics of Ambiguity, without crediting her. But I was also I spent hours trying to find a film clip of Sartre and de Beauvoir. They didn't allow themselves to be filmed until quite near the end of their lives. And this was actually, I believe, a Canadian interview. It was on CBC in the 1950s. And what shocked me was that the interviewer asked Jean-Paul Sartre, how does it feel to be the most preeminent philosopher of your time? And of course, he waxes on and on about that. And finally, they turn to Simone de Beauvoir, who had by that time written The Second Sex, which is really one of the, again, ahead of her time, one of the most phenomenal books that analyzed the gender double bind, the double standards, the question of otherness and existentialism. They turned to Simone de Beauvoir and said, Ms. de Beauvoir, how does it feel to be incomplete since you have not given birth to a child? And they do not even ask her about her writing and her philosophy. So it's no surprise, and given the title of my talk, I started with this, that Virginia Woolf noted, anonymous was most often a woman. And yet Audre Lorde tells us, your silence will not protect you. Donna Brazile also mentioned being proud of being a product of the public schools of New Orleans, and I'm proud to say that I'm a product of the public schools of San Francisco and the Bay Area and California. In fact, the product of 16 public schools, because my mother moved us every year, in part because of poverty, in part because she was fleeing domestic abuse. In all my years of schooling, even as an undergrad and perhaps even as a graduate student, I really had no mentors. I went once and only once to a high school career counselor when I was looking for a summer job. The male career counselor told me my only choice was to learn to type. I knew in my gut that this was a sexist imperative, And I also resisted because my mother supported us in part by typing and transcribing into the wee hours of the night, and the sounds of her electric typewriter haunted me. Now, of course, having written, 3 books and a zillion and a dissertation and all hunting and pecking, I regret, my feminist stance of not learning how to type, but at the time it seemed important. But if you were to ask, Megan, how did you come to be a professor? Who encouraged you to pursue a doctorate and go to graduate school? The answer would be no one. And I raise this because sometimes we have to just follow our gut and follow our passion. And saying that, no one stopped me either. In many ways, I think we don't recognize adversities while we're growing up because we think it's normal unless and until you know differently. To me, normal also includes a whole host of brilliant and talented family members. My mother's father was a renowned composer and conductor who immigrated from Holland to New York and wrote hundreds of film scores for Hollywood. My mother, a brilliant thinker, poet, and activist, herself graduated from Barnard College, and she began graduate school on prestigious fellowship at University of Chicago in the early 1950s. But tragically, her father, the composer, suffered a stroke at the age of 55, and my mother left school to take care of him. The act of taking care of another and foregoing one's life is something that happens to so many women. My father was a poet and actor, my aunt is an artist, as was my cousin Alexandria Charles. And as well, my great-uncle, Phil Rober, a major abstract expressionist painter, a gay man, and thus very treasured inheritance to me in my years of coming out. And the list goes on. But many of these people were lost to suicide, alcoholism, depression, resulting in part from those who were war veterans. So I have witnessed much tragedy and loss in my life, and like so many of you here who have survived Katrina, amongst no doubt many other events, a survivor. And speaking as a survivor, it has been instructive preparing this talk for you today to reflect on my life as a woman committed to fighting for social justice. And while I might not have had mentors, I have been nourished and supported by movements, by social movements, by fellow activists, amazing colleagues and friends, inspired by artists, supported with the unconditional love of partners, and my mother as I've followed this drive of my passion. So what is this passion? My passion as a scholar and public intellectual is to make space in the world for voices that have been silenced. And it turns out this is well described in the words of Audre Lorde, the renowned Black lesbian warrior poet, who said in one of her many powerful speeches, "I write for those women who do not speak, for those who do not have a voice because they were so terrified, because we are taught to respect fear more than ourselves. We've been taught that silence would save us, but it won't." So the first point I'm wanting to stress today is that women will perhaps never escape this double bind. Excuse my language, but the fact is, we're damned if we do, and we're damned if we don't. When we follow our passion and dare to trespass on men's territory, we will encounter demons both real and imagined. Virginia Woolf was asked to write a review of a man's book and spoke of having to murder the angel on the page. It's a wonderful passage in one of her essays, of murder the voice that persistently whispered to her, "You have no right to speak. Women should not write. You have nothing to say, especially about a man." So we must recognize that we all feel this imposter syndrome, and perhaps always will. On the upside, because of this adversity, I believe that women's power takes unexpected, creative, and unique, brilliant forms, and we've seen that throughout the conference this weekend. Women engage creative modes of power within the public sphere. So the second part of my message, which I'm going to illustrate with some fun video clips, I think, today, is one of hope. Women's presence in the public sphere of media is increasing, and I foresee that possibly because the landscape has radically changed within the recent election year, with a woman running for president and a Black man elected, there is and are new spaces and resonances of possibility. Perhaps some of the most binding stereotypes have been shaken up, freeing us to find new and creative ways within those cracks to develop unique transformations of power. So the third part of my message is, since we're damned if we do and damned if we don't, why don't we just go ahead and take the risk? Audre Lorde, as I said, reminds us, your silence will not protect you. So the first images I want to show illustrate that those binaries between the historical image of women taking power in contrast with the backlash that occurs on the part of the dominant culture and patriarchy, which we talked about as a bad word yesterday, and the backlash, which is always based on the ideal of femininity imposed by a male-dominated society. So this is clearly an image of suffragists, and on the other you find all of these caricatures of women in the press at the time. And this fellow has come home to his suffragist wife, and clearly she's in no shape to prepare dinner for him. And it's published by the Campaign Committee National League for Opposing Women's Suffrage. In the second wave of feminism, and again, the I Was a Teenage Feminist that we watched last night really addressed this well, was countered perhaps most famously or most extremely by this quote from Pat Robertson. "The feminist agenda is not about equal rights for women. It is about a socialist, anti-family political movement that encourages women to leave their husbands, kill their children, practice witchcraft, destroy capitalism, and become lesbians." And I was talking to some second wave feminists who said they made T-shirts out of that actually at the time and wore them proudly. And then here we are today. And so, you know, thinking about what is the image of third wave feminism and its counterpart, it's interesting to think that in a way, because it hasn't been in the public eye in the same way, I can't think of a particular image of backlash, though there are many in terms of general caricatures and stereotypes of those who engage in social protest. And I think particularly of anarchists and the way that the media chooses very carefully the words they use to describe protests and/or doesn't cover protests at all, which is a big area of my research. But interestingly, when you look, as I said, if you look on Google Images, you'll find so many caricatures and rude photos of Hillary Clinton. And interestingly, of Sarah Palin, there's really much less, and particularly since the complexity of how she represents herself. And this I didn't find until last night, the Hillary Nutcracker. And Hillary as a, as a beauty queen. So my short story about a wonderful surprise of women's creative potential that gets unleashed when we least expect it, and perhaps the story of third wave activism. I'm working with Kelly Ladd, a wonderful graduate student, and the clips on Women Vlogging Project that I'm going to show you at the end is really one of her brainchilds. She was in a modernity to postmodernity graduate philosophy seminar that I was teaching in the spring. And for the first time in that seminar, perhaps halfway through the semester, we were discussing feminism and queer theory. And the men in the class who had up to that point seemed to be very open-minded and progressively minded, during that class, for the first time, defensively stated what I often hear in undergraduate classes, that they do not see why one would say that men have more power because they don't feel like they have more power. And I have an essay published on that discourse of the I statements, being able to refocus the question of power to the men's I feel statements, and then you get to try to talk to them about their feelings. But anyway, so this happened in our seminar. And lo and behold, the next morning I received from Kelly via email this video that she had made of the sexism directed at Hillary Clinton. And when I asked her what had prompted her to do it, and she, who doesn't describe herself as a feminist, said she was prompted by what had happened in class and she wanted to speak back to the men. So here's what she created.
And sympathy for her. Let's not forget, and I'll be brutal, the reason she's a U.S. Senator, the reason she's a candidate for president, The reason she may be a front runner is her husband messed around.
Yeah, but
That's how she got to be senator from New York. We keep forgetting it. She didn't win there on her merit. She won because everybody felt, my God, this woman stood up under humiliation.
about who's going to be better for women, because isn't that a nice change for everybody to hear?
I'm blown away by that line. I was blown away by it. We're up here arguing about who's going to be better for women because that's a nice change for everybody to hear. Nice change? That's all I have heard my entire adult life, what's good for women. I have not heard one public figure talk about what's good for men. That would be a change. The dishonesty that is at the core of the Democrats' verbiage is so deep that they're not even aware. She's not aware that what she said isn't true. I don't believe she's lying. In order to lie, you have to say something you know not to be true. She really believes this is a nice change. Is there anybody listening to me right now who believes that that is a change? What's good for women? Can you imagine any candidate discussing what's good for men when it is men who are on every social scale behind women? They graduate high school less. They commit suicide more. They do drugs more. They go to jail more. They commit more crimes. They are the victims of far more crimes. They go to college less. They graduate college less. Can you tell me exactly where women are being hurt?
Yes. Thanks to Kelly Ladd, and send her healing energy. She's only 27, and she somehow fell down her stairs a couple days ago and broke a vertebrae in her back. So I hope she gets better very quickly. I wanted to connect a little bit on my early work in the 90s on the politics of emotion, which connects to my interest as a public intellectual in making space for marginalized voices. And let me tell you that the work of interdisciplinarity and the topic of the politics of emotion, neither were very popular approaches or topics. And when I was first a graduate student in philosophy, I felt like I was going to have a nervous breakdown because there was absolutely no space to bring up the question of emotion and subjectivity in the 1980s. And in fact, it was a conference called After the Second Sex, where I heard some of Donna Haraway's work and the work of Barbara McClintock and Evelyn Fox Keller talking about women scientists that really pushed me to pursue this question of emotions and politics and philosophy. I needed an interdisciplinary approach. So I encourage those of you who feel trapped or policed by disciplines to consider interdisciplinarity. So that work has come in very usefully, as actually now in 2009, it's a very hot topic, the question of affect. But it's been really interesting during this campaign to watch how emotion is used to stereotype women. But in the case of Hillary Clinton, it was really quite fascinating because there was so much debate about why she cried. And rather than seeing her actually as a hysterical woman, I think there was a question of her having not been human enough, like that she was some kind of robot and had no human heart. And then when she cried, that she was faking it, and who really knows. But I thought it was a very interesting contrast when Jesse Jackson, the image of Jesse Jackson crying at the, when Obama won, had a very different kind of airplay. And in general, I've noticed that men's emotions, particularly crying, get a lot more respect. A crying woman, it's not as significant. The politics of women's anger, women's fear, women's passion, all of those are so stereotyped in terms of gender norms that women's emotions don't carry the same political force as it does when men express particularly grief. So now what I want to share with you in a couple of different forms as sort of my examples of hope are the ways I think that because of the double bind, because women face these incredible contradictions and the damned if you do, damned if you don't, that women develop these incredibly creative and unique ways of using their power in very different forms. So I want to show you Jane Fonda's appearance on the Colbert Report. Have any of you seen this? Nope. So we all know that Jane Fonda, in her lifetime, has represented so many different things. So it's really phenomenal to see her come on the Colbert Report and take the stage. But a little comment, my research in digital dissent, I've been studying The Daily Show with Jon Stewart and Colbert Report for many years as part of my funded research project. And it's really important to note that Colbert's use of political satire and the space of political satire in general that has become very popular during the 8 years of the Bush administration as a wonderful way to have a voice and a reality check when mainstream corporate media has not been doing their job. And a lot of my work has been about that, about The Daily Show and Colbert, Daily Show in particular, representing like a touchstone of sanity when people felt this crisis of faith in the media. So the fact that in Colbert's political satire that his character is mocking a certain type of the rabid right-wing masculinity through parody, it's that creates the space in which someone like Jane Fonda can enter and transform the moment, taking power. So I want to point out that it's not just any stage that she's coming onto. It's partly the Colbert didn't intend the space of satire to open spaces for women. And God knows that there's no women writers on either of those shows. There's very few women that appear on the shows, et cetera. But it is that space of political satire that creates a new kind of movement and voice that allows her to come in this way. I'm also going to start a social movement against what's called geo-blocking, because in Canada we can't even access the Comedy Central, and it's really difficult, and there's absolutely no way to download any of these clips, so you have to rely on the internet.
My guest tonight is here to talk about her new movie, Georgia Rule. I'll remind her my Colbert rule. The real peach state is South Carolina. Please welcome Jane Fonda. Ms. Fonda, thank you so much for joining us.
Mr. Colbert.
Lovely to see you. What is
It's wonderful to see you.
Is this? Are we doing flute? What is this?
I got to talk to you.
Yeah, you do.
No,
I gotta talk to you too.
I've been dreaming about your lips ever since the first time. You have the sweetest, softest lips. But let me tell you something.
Yeah, go on, please.
I saw the show where you put your fantasies about me on notice.
Yeah, you saw that one, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
You don't do that, Stephen.
What? Excuse me?
You don't do that.
Don't put
no.
my fantasies about Jane Fonda on
That's
notice?
right. You don't do that.
Okay, nobody puts baby in a corner is what you're saying.
No, you embrace your fantasies.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it's happening right now.
Yeah, that's good.
So let's talk about the movie.
Okay. Georgia Rule. I'm Georgia. I got
You're
roll.
Georgia in it. Yeah. I believe we have a clip. Jim, can we roll that, please?
Put this in your mouth, get in your car, and drive.
I love your mother, and I love Rachel, and I would never do anything. Ow! What are you doing?
You do not take the Lord's name in vain.
I am not moving. I'm staying right here. Swear to God.
If you don't put that in your mouth soon, I'm gonna dismantle your car.
Okay.
I like to see a woman who believes that violence is the answer.
Now you know what's going to happen to you if you put your fantasies about me on notice. Okay, I just want
No, now I know what's going to happen to me when I go home tonight to my wife. Okay. So let's talk about war protesting for a moment, shall we? Sure. Now you were integral to the anti-war effort in the early '70s. That's the only ear I hear out of Jane. That is a
nice.
firm leg. That is nice.
No,
This is not exactly how I expected this interview to go.
No, Stephen, listen
Yes,
to me.
yes.
We
What are you
have
adjusting every time
we
you do that?
have to
What is
be-
the...
Well, because I'm
You see the flesh on? Now, what was it like working with Lindsay Lohan?
No. Let's go back to the war. We cannot elect men to office that are afraid of premature evacuation.
And Felicity Huffman was also in the movie, I see. She's a wonderful actress.
Felicity?
Felicity Huffman, yes.
Felicity, they're both fantastic.
They
Yeah,
are
they
great.
are.
Now, this is about 3 women living together in Idaho in some sort of
And I'm Georgia.
lesbian coven. Is that what it is?
I'm Georgia, and I have rules.
What are your rules? I have rules too, and you're breaking several of them right now.
You
rules
are
I
so
have to live by.
cute, man.
That is nice
Yeah.
of you to say.
You have, and I'm not
Yes.
kidding. You have the best lips.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That is
Why do
nice.
you think I didn't just kiss you once the first time I came on your show? I came back for more. Right?
Yes, we had a bit of a freaky 3-way with Gloria Steinem, which is something I think very few people have been able to say.
Yeah, way to go, Jane Fonda. So I wanted to show that with you because, frankly, he never, I don't know how many of you watch The Daily Show, but he never loses his cool. And he never, nobody ever gets the upper hand in those interviews. So to me, that was a remarkable form of women's power. It was brilliant, brilliant. So I realize, I don't know what's happening with time. I have a little bit more to go. We started late, so I'm going to take some time to finish up. But I was going to show you, and I want to recommend that you look on Comedy Central at Amy Goodman's interview on Colbert Report. It's really fantastic, but because she also doesn't let him derail her. She keeps absolutely on point. It's really remarkable. I have a lot of respect for Amy Goodman. She's utterly tireless, unflagging in her work. And in terms of women in the media, she's done an amazing job. When I interviewed her for my book, Digital Media and Democracy, and speaking of that, you have a discount form on your handout. I noticed the bookstore seems to be out of them. But anyway, in the interview in that book, when I was asking her what it was like to be on Stephen Colbert, she said, I had been prepped. I had been told, go talk to Stephen Colbert like you're talking to a drunk in a bar. And when you see her on the interview, she does just a phenomenal job. So I want to talk a little bit about how for the past number of years, my focus hasn't been specifically on gender, but really has been on the question of how to make space for voices of digital dissent, particularly after September 11th, 2001. I was at Virginia Tech when that happened, and I've always had an interest in how the news represented protests. So at the time, I got a $50,000 grant to work closely with graduate students to build this site, Critical Media Literacy in Times of War, and the URL is there. I urge you to use it with students when you want to get them to think critically about how the news can tell on itself, because it looks at the effects of sanctions in Iraq, the number of people who protested at different Iraq and Afghanistan protests, and the number of civilian casualties. And what it does is show how different news from international and national news sources tell very different stories about the same event. So there's no need to opinionate or editorialize on this. You just show what the news does. So I was in the middle of this project when Tim Russert came to speak at Virginia Tech. And I want to just read to you my engagement with Tim Russert at Virginia Tech. And this was just a couple of weeks prior to the invasion of Iraq. And I think this will show you something about the climate that we shouldn't forget about that existed, that accounts for the erosion of civil liberties in the United States, and something we're still going to have to repair given all of the work that was done by the Bush administration. On a cold March night in southwestern Virginia in 2003, 1 week prior to the U.S. invasion of Iraq, I filed into a packed auditorium of 2,000 students, including the entire corps of Virginia Tech military cadets dressed in white pants, white gloves, and navy blue hats. Tim Russert, host of Meet the Press, a weekly news magazine that airs on U.S. network television, was the first to speak on the topic of the impending U.S.-led invasion of Iraq. A professor at the university at the time, I was in the midst of conducting research for this website, Critical Media Literacy in Times of War. For over a year, we'd been immersed in examination of how and what different news sources were reporting on the things I just told you. I was steeped in international press coverage related to Bush's threatened war, and as the talk progressed, it became evident that Russert was omitting central arguments against the preemptive attacks that had been widely published in most international and some domestic news media in early 2003. Describing his talk as an objective evaluation of the bipartisan views represented in news media, Russert concluded his speech by saying that, given journalism's objective work reporting the facts, Bush's proposed invasion was justified and warranted. I was first to the microphone for the question and answer period. As Russert spoke, I had written down carefully worded remarks identifying key facts reported in respected news sources that he had neglected to mention. Outlining these omitted arguments, I asked Russert if he had read any international news sources and suggested that he seemed extremely partisan in his selection of news coverage and consequent appraisal of the situation. His face turning red, Russert shouted that I had no right to claim to be a professor given my misreading of the facts. Cheering on Russert's cowardly attack, the audience began hissing and booing at me when I attempted a reply. I was forced to retreat to my seat, genuinely afraid. As I left the auditorium, I feared I would be accosted and was grateful for the few people who thanked me on my way out. It was at that moment that I realized the potency of the active silencing of dissent and how distorted myths of journalistic objectivity could be used to justify something as devastating as the bombing of a nation and its people. Of course, my experience was not unusual. This was during the post-9/11 period in the U.S. when academics who seemed unpatriotic were being blacklisted, and the newspaper at the university reported the sparks that flew, saying, after Russert's lecture, questions were taken from various audience members, one of whom was a professor who engaged Russert in a heated debate. She accused Russert of not presenting objective journalism and of having a pro-war stance on Iraq, sentiments to which a small portion of the audience applauded. Russert rebutted by saying he presented the views of the administration and was objective, and that she needed to re-examine her facts. So I've had the good fortune then to move to Toronto. Being at Virginia Tech, I was always on the front lines of something. It's a very hard culture to survive. And this book is one of the things that's come out of my research on Rethinking Media and Democracy. And really briefly, I'm just going to give you a few glimpses of what that research is about, and then close with my next project, which is on the women bloggers, and open it up for Q&A. So what's really interested me is the public crisis of faith and truth-telling. And I began to perceive in those years that I'm talking about, this sense that there is a lack of faith in media and politicians, and that it's a widespread lack of faith. And that happened to coincidentally happen at the same time that there was increased access to digital media production and circulation. So it's one of those flukes of history that just as the United States was eroding free press and civil liberties, that we have access to blogging and other forms of citizen journalism. So you can think about all sorts of things that have been recorded and sent out to counter mainstream and corporate-owned media. So what I saw was this increased demand for truthful accounts alongside this sense that all the world's a construction, with the result being that, in a sense, we're living in irony. All we're certain of is that we're being lied to. And I wanted to figure out, although I hadn't done qualitative research in the past, how to examine this. So I've spent the last 4 years now examining, interviewing, surveying, finding out how people in different web-based communities who use social media practice to put out both right-wing and left-wing views from all partisan positions, how and why they engage in this kind of digital dissent. And so it's really trying to get at what pushes people to become active citizens and use the internet for this kind of citizenship activity. And just briefly, some of the findings are that indeed the motivations are to make a statement, express oneself and to be heard, anger and frustration with current events or political issues, a desire to influence others and especially to influence election results, and to offer a corrective function to counter the media. In terms of the findings on gender, and this is part of what has returned me to the question of gender and digital media, when we would do the surveys and interviews, we would ask, how many other people who are producing viral videos in your community, how many other bloggers that you know are women? What's the percentage of women and men? And invariably, people would scratch their head. They would basically have no idea. They would not have ever reflected on it. And when they finally do answer it, they say, well, actually, there's very few women. But really, that's not an issue. What matters is not somebody's gender, it matters what is the quality of what they put forth. And so that idea of meritocracy or quality trumping gender is really interesting to me. At the same time, I want to note that given my passion for The Daily Show and Colbert, there are two really powerful women behind the scenes of The Daily Show and Colbert. And one is Lisa Rain, who has a website called On Lisa Rain's Radar, and she was one of the first people to start archiving every episode of the show in QuickTime, which, because you can't download any of them, is really a phenomenal thing. She stopped doing that, but we really don't have public access to it because it's owned by Viacom and we can't download it. And the other is D.B. Ferguson, a newer blogger who doesn't see herself as political or feminist in any way, but she has two really phenomenal websites, fan sites, one called No Fact Zone and another called Colbert University. And one thing I've learned about that when I first started this work, I decided not to look at fan sites because I didn't see them as explicitly political, and I wanted to look at engaged citizenship. I have had to rethink that from from the beginning point, and we've gone back to that, and now I'm really thinking about when I say that there's new forms of feminism, and maybe we need a different word for it, new forms of activism that will be possible. I think we need to be thinking really broadly and widely so that even these kinds of engaged, active, online digital citizenship, while not explicitly political, are a really important form of engaged citizenship. So given time, I'm not going to share with you some of the things that Lisa Rain and D.B. Ferguson said. The last point I wanted to make, it's really phenomenal as well that Rachel Maddow is an out lesbian who now has her own show on MSNBC. And one thing I noticed as I was looking at clips of the images of her online, in fact, she's quite identified, I think, as butch. Those pictures of her when she was on Air America or in her personal life, they've really had to change her appearance for this show. So I think that's pretty interesting. And finally, I'm going to share with you again, the wonderful Kelly Ladd has been studying 200 women vloggers, and anybody out there who knows of a good funding source that would fund this project, do let me know. But this is just a small sampling of the whole range of what women are doing with vlogging. And again, not all of it is explicitly political, but there's really interesting contradictions. So you notice my title was From Anonymous to Hot for Words. You'll see Hot for Words in here, and I urge you to go look at her site. Some of these women are on there in bikinis trying to make their way to Hollywood. Some women are dykes, and some women are 70 years old. There's a lot of different motivations. Hot for Words is one of the most interesting contradictions where, like Jane Fonda, she's using her body, but she's a scholar of language. She's interested in the etymology of words. So Hot for Words is her show about where do words come from, and she offers these lessons in the etymology of words while she's dressed in scanty clothes. So do check out Hot for Words as one of the most interesting forms of women's creative power.
Twilight series is addicting. I said I wouldn't read it, and I was stupid. And I promised my friend I'd buy it, and convince her I couldn't get obsessed.
Was accused of being American and secretly lying about my Caribbean heritage. Spent Christmas Day in the hospital last year because I had pneumonia. I'm ovulating. Created a game called Coconut Ball where you pick a coconut off of a tree and hurl it at your opponent. If it smashes them in the face, then they lose. I plan on taking it worldwide. Wear a ring on my
How
wedding.
you doing? Oh my god, I have to tell you, I just got back from the weirdest audition ever. It was for this company called
Hello and welcome to Can I Ask You Something? A new series that I'm starting right now, and that's where I ask you a question and hopefully you answer it with a video response and comment in my box because
You all call her YouTube celebrity, but she's still a real person, therefore she's crazy. So what is your problem, Cupcake?
Well, it's the internet. Ever since YouTube featured one of my videos on the front page, I've been getting a lot of feedback, and I've kind of become an overnight sensation, if you will. I don't know, all the attention is overwhelming.
Sometimes you get a comment that just makes your day. This is from Chris. You're way too old to be using YouTube.
Hello, my dear students. Your teacher, Hot for Words, is back with a new lesson. But first, I want to thank all of you guys for the great oxymoron in the comments of my last video.
Tweet. Follow me. Tweet me, Twitter me. Follow me. I'm awake now. I'm brushing my teeth. Tweet. I'm checking the mail now.
I've recorded this like 20 times, and maybe because I feel obligated to make this vlog, and once you fucking feel obligated to make a vlog, it always turns out like shit. It always does. But, you know, January 1st, besides marking an entirely new year, marks the day that I posted my first vlog.
So, in closing, my hope is that I do see new forms of women's power being created through digital media, through our diverse forms of activism and public voice. Women are truly a force to be reckoned with. And I have no idea why I'm standing before you today, except that I somehow have the tenacity of a pit bull. I never give up. It's a blessing and a curse, as you can see from my opening, when my tenacity hit that serious bottom, trying to control airplanes and weather and my mother. But at least I sleep well at night because I follow my passion. And we might not have mentors. We may not know where we are going. And we face that double bind that we'll be punished for being powerful women because for many reasons the dominant culture and old boys do not want us trespassing or violating the rules of gender. But I truly take heart from Audre Lorde's leadership and her vision. She says, I have come to believe over and over again that what is most important must be spoken, made verbal and shared, even at the risk of having it bruised or misunderstood. And I really hope that leaving this conference this weekend that we will go out there with the diverse forms of power we have and feel the strength of all of the women behind us as we take on the world and make it a different place with all of our movements and actions and cherished beliefs. Thank you.